Good morning and welcome into week 6 video overview for Bible in 90 days. Today, Sunday, is your first of 2 grace days. Really what we're doing is reading the Bible in 88 days. There are 2 grace days built in. Today is the first, and the second will be once we are at the end of the Old Testament. So you have a day off from reading today if you're caught up. If you're not, this is a chance for you to get caught up as we move into a new section of Scripture beginning tomorrow. Let's have a quick look at where we are in the Old Testament as a whole. We've now completed the Torah, or the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And we have also now completed the historical books, which tell the history of Israel from their wandering in the wilderness to entering the promised land through the period of the judges and the kings, and then the conquest and exile in Babylon, and then the return from exile back to Jerusalem in Ezra and Nehemiah. So now we've read through the history books, and now we're going to transition into a section called the writings, and then we'll conclude later with the prophets. The writings are a section in our Bible that moves from Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And it's these 5 books that we're going to cover over the next 2 weeks. So this coming week, we're going to read the book of Job, and then we'll begin to read the book of Psalms. Psalms is a long book. There's 150 Psalms, so it'll take some time to move through Psalms. So then next week we'll finish Psalms and move through Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. So although this coming week we're just reading Job and then we get into the Psalms, I would like to cover all of these 5 books except Psalms this week, and then in next week's overview video it will just focus on the Psalms. I know this is a little bit out of order, but I think it's easiest to cover Job along with Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. These books are sometimes called the wisdom literature, and they sort of have interrelated themes that are helpful to cover together. So I hope that's okay with y'all and doesn't throw you off too much if we cover those in a little bit of a different order. So today let's look at the wisdom literature in the Bible, beginning with the book of Proverbs. Proverbs represents what we might call mainstream wisdom traditions that were taught in Israel. Proverbs is a book of sayings and collections of sayings. Some sayings stand on their own as one little individual proverb, and other collections of proverbs have a sort of unifying message that you find as you read them as a whole. Some of these collections of proverbs actually appear to originate outside of Israel, in places as far as Egypt, where wisdom literature was popular. So Israel wasn't the only nation to be fond of these sort of wisdom sayings. Here's a brief outline of the book of Proverbs. It begins with an intro and a sort of thesis statement at the very beginning about why wisdom is valuable, why we ought to pursue it. Chapters 1 through 9 are the instructions of a child to a parent, sort of passing on of wisdom from one generation to the next. Chapters 10 through 21 are a collection of proverbs associated with King Solomon. You may remember that wisdom is a trait that was strongly associated with King Solomon, particularly years and years after his life. As we saw some in the book of Chronicles, he's really remembered for his great wisdom, which is something that he asked God for at the beginning of his reign. Chapters 22 through 24 form a sort of interlude between Solomon's Proverbs, and they are a collection of sayings from anonymous sages. Then there's a second collection of Proverbs associated with King Solomon in chapters 25 through 29, and then in chapters 30 and 31, there are 3 more mini collections associated with certain figures. The book of Proverbs, and like these 5 books that we're about to read these next 2 weeks, are really not about plot. There's not really a story being told. They're much more just a collection of wisdom sayings, and as such, it becomes very hard to date them in terms of when they originated because there aren't historical markers that give you clues about when they might have originated, so people aren't sure about that. Uh, so this is going to be a different sort of read than what we've been doing. We're moving from prose to poetry, and so you'll read many fewer words overall because the formatting of poetry in the Bible, of course, is much more staggered. But you probably ought to read a little bit slower as well if you really want to soak in the beauty of these poems that we'll be reading in the coming weeks. So fewer words, but read a little bit more slowly so that you can take them all in. Now, what is a proverb? Well, a proverb is simply a saying, a short saying that illustrates something that is generally true in life. Proverbs usually consist of two parts, part A and part B. A will describe something that can be commonly observed in life, and then B either draws a lesson from what was said in A, or draws some kind of comparison from what is said in A, or maybe even draws some kind of contrast from what is said in A. It makes an opposite observation. For example, Proverbs 10:7 says, "The remembrance of the righteous person is a blessing." That's A. But the name of evil people rots. That's B. So here A makes a certain assertion, right? Good people are remembered well. And B asserts the opposite, which is also true. Namely that although good people are remembered well, bad people are not. Another example of a proverb comes from Proverbs 21:15, or rather Proverbs 20:15. It says, "There is gold and there are many pieces of coral, but the most precious object is the lips of knowledge." So here A makes a certain observation, namely that there are lots of valuable things in the world, like gold and coral, naturally. And B draws a lesson from A, saying, although there are lots of beautiful things in the world, nothing is more beautiful than lips that speak wisdom. So the vast majority of Proverbs will follow this A and B format, with A and B relating to one another in different ways. Proverbs are sayings that point to commonly observed truths in certain areas of life, especially family and friends, work and leisure, and so on. They seek to make sense of the world, and they assume that the world is ordered in a certain predictable way. They also aim to bring more order to human life as they instruct people to follow these orderly principles and thereby create a more reliable and predictable and stable society, as well as create individual happiness. Modern proverbs that we use exhibit the sorts of principles that the biblical book of Proverbs is trying to convey as well. Think of things like, "You sleep in the bed you make," right? Or, "What goes around comes around." These are sorts of modern sayings that have a deeper meaning and are generally true, can be generally observed. And so in this way, Proverbs is full of excellent principles that generally lead to prosperity when followed, even today. However, Proverbs doesn't really speak to what happens when things don't go according to plan, or when things play out in an unpredictable way. They don't speak to the situations in life that are in fact unjust or unfair. What do we say, for example, among us in our society, when we have to sleep in a bed that someone else made, or when what goes around doesn't come around, when people get away with things? These are the sorts of things that are much harder when we think life should be ordered and predictable, but we all know that life doesn't always play out that way, and the biblical authors knew that too. So although Proverbs then represents sort of the dominant wisdom tradition in Israel, a counter tradition was also present that aimed to address something that Proverbs really doesn't, namely injustice or unfairness. So Ecclesiastes and Job explore questions not of human prosperity and well-being, as in Proverbs, but rather questions of human limitations, including the limitations of wisdom itself, the limitations to what we can and cannot know. So we move from Proverbs, which is the dominant tradition and assumes a predictable world, and then we move into the books of Job and Ecclesiastes, which describe circumstances that don't fall into the pattern that Proverbs observes and tries to draw wisdom from those situations. So let's go and look at Job first, as this is the book that we are on the brink of beginning this coming week. If ever there were a character in the Bible who surely abided faithfully by everything that exists in Proverbs, all the principles that are there in Proverbs, surely this would have been Job. Job is the ultimate in righteousness. He is an upright and admirable figure. And so we would think that his life would be entirely predictable and ordered and controlled, as Proverbs might suggest. And yet Job loses everything. And so the book that bears his name addresses the biggest question that exists within monotheism, and that is the question of divine justice. Is God just? It's a big question and a bold question for a human to ask, but the book of Job seeks to address that question. After all, in a monotheistic view of the world, if there is only one God in heaven, then surely God must be somehow responsible for suffering and injustice, since there's not a equally powerful second evil God doing battle against the good God in heaven. There's only one God, and so if indeed that God is powerful but also just, how is it that suffering can happen to righteous people who don't deserve it? People like Job. And that's the question that the book of Job seeks to address. Job, of course, is one of the hardest books for modern readers because it paints God, frankly, in a rather bad light. God seems to be playing games with humans. God seems to be making Job a sort of pawn in a divine bet with Satan. Now, at the beginning of this story, we are given a window into heaven, and we see Satan and God having a conversation about Job, God's most righteous servant. At this time in history, Satan is not the sort of diabolical devil that he is later on in Scripture. Here, Satan is not even a proper name. It's simply a noun that means adversary or accuser. Certainly, Satan has no power except that which God gives him, and in this text he serves as a sort of accuser of Job before God, but all of the suffering that follows really ultimately can only come from God, because God is the one that allows Satan to inflict Job with his suffering. So Satan tells God that the only reason Job is righteous is because God has blessed Job so much, and so if those blessings were removed, then Job would no longer be righteous and would, in fact, curse God. That is the accusation of this accuser figure in Job. And God says, no, Job is righteous apart from the blessings, and you can go and inflict him with suffering, and that will prove that that's true. So that's the sort of background to what happens to Job that we get in the first couple of chapters. And then in a horrible series of events, Job loses everything, all of his wealth and his family, and he suffers enormously through very painful skin boils and all sorts of things. And the first two chapters sort of set up this situation that's going on in the book of Job. And then the vast majority of the book of Job, chapters 3 through 42, contain poems that poetically address Job's suffering and wrestle with how to understand it. Chapters 3 through 31 contain a series of poetic conversations that Job has with three of his friends who come to comfort him in his misery. His three friends are named Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. You don't often hear people named after these biblical figures, and rightfully so, because they're lousy friends. They seek to blame Job's suffering on him. And in so doing, it addresses something that we continue to hear today when people blame other people's suffering on their own sinfulness. For example, you'll occasionally hear about someone who receives a bad diagnosis, and some rather heartless person will say, well, there must be some sin in your life that's causing God to punish you. And of course, most of us know today that that's not only nonsense, but a terribly insensitive thing to say. But that's more or less what Job's friends will say to him when they come to comfort him. And so, in many ways, Job is a reflection on that same attitude that we sometimes hear today. And thankfully, the book of Job will ultimately reject that perspective. So essentially, all of these friends will accuse Job of being responsible for the calamities that have come upon him, and they ultimately will not prove to be any help to Job at all. Chapters 32 through 37 are a series of poetic speeches by another character named Elihu. They're much more sort of monologues than anything else, less conversational, but he doesn't really lend any more insight than Job's other three friends do. And so when we get to chapters 38 through 42, it comes time to resolve the tensions that have been explored before. And this is the climactic event where Job and God meet and have a conversation and exchange perspectives on everything that has happened. God finally answers God's critics who have been blaming God for Job's calamities and accusing God of injustice, and including Job. Job has been making these claims throughout the book, and then finally God answers Job in these final chapters of the book. So as a whole, the book of Job examines several major themes, major questions. For example, does God use power to benefit all of creation, even at the expense of human beings? How powerful is God really? Also, what language is useful for describing God and God's relationship to human beings? What can we know about God and what can we not know? But the most central question, again, that the book of Job seeks to address is simply this: is God just? Is God just? And in the book's final chapters, as God speaks to Job, this question is addressed but never fully answered. The book of Job leaves this question in tension. What we do see in the final chapters as God speaks to Job is, one, that God communicates with human beings, which is a good sign that God cares about them. God also knows far more than humans ever can and cares for all of creation in ways that humans cannot understand. God is quick to point that out in those final speeches. These final chapters also suggest that not all human suffering can be directly blamed on human sin, as Job's friends have suggested. But this doesn't leave God alone responsible either for those sins. Sin exists in a sort of web that affects a lot of people directly and indirectly. And finally, though God remains unknown, God can be known to the extent that God decides to make himself known in dialogue with humanity. So there's strong themes of revelation, God's self-revealing, that we find in the book of Job. Taken as a whole, we might wonder what to make of this peculiar book. It is noteworthy that Job is a Gentile, and so as such, he may represent the people of Israel as a whole in their alienation from God during the exile, if indeed this book has exilic origins. Perhaps Job is a representation of the people feeling rejected and plagued, literally, by their God. If this is the case, Job is not really meant to stand as a paradigm for every person. In other words, we probably shouldn't read our own everyday lives into the story of the book of Job. Perhaps Job is more meant to represent the fate of the people of Israel as a whole. That's one way that some interpreters interpret the book. Within the poetry of Job itself, there are all sorts of different literary forms. I know Job can start to feel a little bit long as you wade through these dialogues, but stay patient because it's really beautiful poetry if you can get beyond the sort of disturbing setting in which these poems take place. It's really a beautiful read. You'll find courtroom disputations as though God and Job were on a trial in a courtroom. You'll find proverbs and hymns and lamentations, all sorts of incredible literary devices throughout the book of Job. So take your time in reading it. In the end, Job's fortunes are restored as God puts everything as close to normal as possible. Those who died don't come back to life, but Job does get new children and things like that. Clearly, this is a representation of the disturbance that many readers must have had upon reading Job, and this is, I think, probably an effort to salvage God's reputation by restoring everything, but I think the text remains, of course, very difficult for us to understand and interpret. And in the end, the tension remains for readers ever since, and it will remain for us today as well as we make our way through the book of Job. So that's Job. Let's refresh briefly for a moment that we've got Proverbs, which is sort of the mainstream wisdom literature tradition in the Bible that assumes that the world is predictable and ordered. And then we've got Job and Ecclesiastes that provide a sort of counter-narrative or a balancing perspective and assess what happens when the world isn't so predictable and when the world isn't so fair. Job is a story about the life of one particular person, and that story as a whole addresses that question of divine justice. The book of Ecclesiastes also represents this sort of counter-narrative in the wisdom tradition presented alongside the book of Proverbs that provides a contrast to not only Proverbs, but also the earnestness and the hope of a better world that the prophetic tradition will build on, that we'll get to in a few weeks from now. So Ecclesiastes is really different than the vast majority of the Old Testament. So if Proverbs explores the heights of human potential and wisdom, Ecclesiastes explores the limits of human potential and wisdom. For Ecclesiastes, there are limits to wisdom, to human aspiration, even to human jubilation or celebration. The author values self-awareness and self-restraint. The main themes of the book of Ecclesiastes are things like this. Life is repetitive. It goes in circles. There's a lack of progress over time. There's nothing really that's ever new. Everything is as it's always been and will always be. But also certain pleasures in life are useful to ward off the despair that comes from this circular and non-progressing world. Because ultimately, there's a failure to find ultimate meaning within human society. So these are some of the themes that we read about in the book of Ecclesiastes. This might sound pretty negative to you, but as you'll read it, you'll probably observe that Ecclesiastes isn't, nihilistic by any means, or even cynical. In the end, the conclusion of the book seems to be that happiness can be found even within the realm of human limitations. So for those whose happiness is dependent upon some kind of progress, either in their own lives or in the life of society, and that progress never comes, then that happiness would also never come. But Ecclesiastes seems to say that happiness can be found even within the monotony of life. So we shouldn't just toil our days away under the sun. We should also take time to enjoy life's pleasures because we'll never be able to toil enough to then eventually just sit back and relax and enjoy life. We have to find pleasure in the here and now. So if the book of Proverbs, again to draw a contrast, if the book of Proverbs is structured with if A is true, then B is also true, Ecclesiastes is structured like this. While A is true, there is also not A, and there is also kind of A. In other words, life is not always as predictable as Proverbs sometimes assumed, nor is human progress always as tenable as Proverbs sometimes assumes. It's very hard to sketch the structure of the book of Ecclesiastes because the organization of the book itself is rather circular, just in the same way that it views human wisdom. So perhaps that structure is intentional. By the way, the Hebrew name of the book of Ecclesiastes is Koheleth, and the Greek name for it is Ecclesiastes. They have similar meanings, but the book has come to contain the Greek name that was given to it in the Septuagint. So if you see something about Koheleth, that's simply the Hebrew version of the book of Ecclesiastes. Once we get through Ecclesiastes, the last book to cover is the book of Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon. This is a peculiar book that you've probably never heard preached before. It's a love poem that explores the depths of human longing. Song of Songs explores the depths of human longing. Love is a powerful thing, stronger than death, as the Song of Solomon asserts. And yet also love never finds complete fulfillment either. This book points to this existential struggle that human beings have because we have such a fundamental need to love and be loved, and yet we never quite experience that in its ultimate fulfillment, at least not here in this life. Even our moments of greatest bliss seem to be few and far between, don't they? And those moments can seem to be fleeting. More often than not, we just sort of long for an even deeper grasp of love, or to be known at an even deeper level, and we don't always find that even from the people who we love most and who love us most. So the narrator of this poem seems to understand that, and the book will progress towards this idea of the consummation of love, but that last act of the book never happens. It just sort of ends unresolved. Now, this is a strange book to interpret. Certainly, throughout its history, the book has usually been interpreted allegorically. The two lovers in the book have been seen as God and Israel, or as Jesus and the church. So that's an allegorical interpretation of these two characters in the book. The characters at times do seem to fit easily into an allegorical interpretation, and so that's often how it's been understood. By the way, this book uses family language to describe the lovers. The lovers describe themselves as brother and sister. This is not incestuous. It sounds strange to us, but in the ancient Near East, this was a common enough thing because brother and sister were terms that reflected the closest intimacy between people of that familial love, and so it was often applied to romantic lovers as well. So as you read this book, don't be alarmed by that terminology. You might ask, why is Song of Solomon even in the Bible? What does this have to do with God? But its search for a love that is stronger than death has made it a profoundly religious text ever since it emerged, and certainly, from a New Testament perspective, the love of Christ for us that saves us, that endures beyond death, and in fact to life eternal, gives it a strong connection to the themes of God's love for us in Jesus Christ. And ultimately, it's a text that celebrates mutual intimacy and passion, and it celebrates the depths of human love. And so, for that reason, its readers have found it compelling, and perhaps you will find it compelling too as you read. So that's all for today. Blessings to you as you take a rest day if you're caught up. if you need to get caught up, I hope you're able to today. And tomorrow we begin the book of Job, and then we'll get into the Psalms later this week. Like I said before, next Sunday's overview will just be on the Psalms. I want to make sure we spend plenty of time talking about that most important book. So we will discuss Psalms next week, and then after the Psalms, we'll proceed into the rest of the wisdom literature. So keep up the good work. Thanks for reading. I hope you enjoy this change of pace from prose to poetry, from narrative to wisdom. Be blessed in your reading, and have a great week. Take care.